Hey everyone, welcome back to the Jacobin Show. I'm Jen Pan. You probably have noticed that my usual co-host Paul Prescod is not here with me today. Instead, we have Nando Vila. You obviously know him from the Weekends show. Nando, what's up?
Big shoes to fill. I'm just happy I got called up for the majors on the main show. The weekend show. It's Saturday. It's a little chiller. This is the weekday. It's time to work.
It's the weekday. You've got your button-up shirt on, and you're ready to rock and roll.
Yes, I am, as always.
As always. So we, of course, have our good friend, the editor of Jacobin, Bhaskar Sunkara, coming on a little later to talk about social democracy, of course, what it is not, how we achieve it. But before he comes on, I wanted to just bring up, I guess, what we might say is lack of social democracy, aka the complete paucity of the welfare state, of social supports in this country. Of course, we talk about this all the time on the Jacobin Show, and on you guys on Weekends do as well. But the reason why this subject was on my mind, especially this week, is the Capitol riots, or rather the fallout from the Capitol riots. So, of course, earlier this week, the Republicans filibustered an attempt to launch an independent investigation into the Capitol riots. The Capitol riots, I think, there have been a lot of opinions about them. You've talked about them on the Weekend show, Nando. I know you've been a critic of kind of using the Capitol riots as a pretext for beefing up the security state. We can get into that. I do want to mention, I don't know if anybody remembers this, but when the Capitol riots happened, which was pretty much 6 months to the day almost, January 6th, of course, we were actually doing a Jacobin show that day, and we sort of went live as the news was sort of unfolding.
I remember.
You do? Yeah.
Yeah.
And we kind of like commented on it in real time. But of course, 6 months have passed since then. I don't know that I have a ton of different opinions on what happened, but I wanted to throw it to you briefly, Nando, before we kind of get into conspiracy theories and what else is in the news and the world of conspiracy theory. Have your thoughts on the Capitol riots changed not just since they sort of took place, but given all of the media, back and forth about them in the time between January and now?
I guess, I don't know that it's changed too much. I think my general take on it is that it was bad. It was a scary thing as it was happening, but you can already just foresee the problems with the reaction to it.
Mm-hmm.
On the one hand, you have liberals basically like with their hair on fire about it, saying it was this kind of this unprecedented assault on our democracy, mm-hmm. and being very outraged that certain people would question the outcome of the election, which we won fair and square. Like, I remember the year 2000. I was old enough to remember that, and where they just kind of
Likewise.
that they just absorbed that and moved on with their lives. So I don't really take them that seriously on that front. And then, Luke Savage had a piece in the Atlantic this week where he talked about the sort of the cognitive dissonance between liberals just talking about this kind of unprecedented assault on our democracy, not just the Capitol riots, but Republican attempts to overthrow elections or overturn elections, reduce the franchise, and then they just do nothing about it, like nothing, mm-hmm. No opposition, any meaningful opposition. Whereas the Republicans are passing, I think the Brennan Center for Justice said that they were passing 361 voter restriction bills in state legislatures across the country. Is there an equivalent response from the Democrats? Like, no. So exactly. I don't take them that seriously. And that their only responses are beefing up, Capitol security, in like these FBI investigations into like who was actually at the riot, and getting people to snitch on each other as to like, if you know someone who was there, contact your local FBI office or whatever. Like, all of that is just bad. It's just bad. Mm-hmm. And you could just see it happening very clearly.
Yeah. I also want to add, since the Capitol riots happened, and, there, of course, was not this formal like Senate investigation, but journalists have been covering it. As you said, people have been like informing on each other, turning each other in. We've gotten a lot more information about what exactly happened on that day since then. And, I think that there's strong evidence that there was no plan for a fascist coup. Now, were there some, I know, Nando, you're like raising your eyebrows at me. Were there some like extreme right-wing nutcases there who were trying to do that? Of course there were. Like, guys showed up with bombs. Not everybody. I mean, there were. I said this on a different show with David Griscom, but like I was actually surprised, being from Idaho, that like there weren't that many guns there, and that's because DC is not an open carry area, which I think is pretty important. I mean, that shows that
may have saved lives.
Exactly. But that said, there were some guns. Clearly some people did show up with the intention of doing violence, but I think that in the time since the Capitol riots occurred and now, we have more information, such as, there was this famous picture of a guy with zip ties, and it was like, he's going to like kidnap the Congress people. It turns out upon further inspection, maybe he would have, but what had happened was he was there with his mom. He had like found some of those zip ties on the ground that like some Capitol Police officer had abandoned, and just sort of picked them up, and I guess was caught in that like, fateful shot. And like, he's been identified and he's going to face like criminal prosecution. So again, I don't say this to downplay what happened. As you say, obviously it was, extremely scary. It shouldn't have happened, but I think, I think sometimes sort of blowing the fascist whistle or raising the fascist alarm sort of obscures what I think is another dangerous element of the Capitol riot. And Danny Bessner and Amber Frost have a really great article in Jacobin that came out sort of closer to the event, which talked about the presence of QAnon adherents at the Capitol that day. We all know now at this point that there were a lot of QAnon type people there. Most famously, of course, the QAnon shaman with his like buffalo hat and no shirt. And, just like complete crazy getup. And the reason why I bring up QAnon is, I'll back up for a second. There was a New York Times article that came out earlier this week, which talked about how QAnon beliefs are on the rise. The public, I think it's, what is it called? The Public Religion Research Institute conducted a survey, and they basically found that 15% of the people they surveyed believed in QAnon or some, aspects of the QAnon kind of worldview. So I'm just looking at the first graph here, but it says the government, media, and financial worlds in the US are controlled by a group of Satan-worshipping pedophiles who run a global sex trafficking operation. And as you can see, almost 23% of Republicans believe that, 15% of all Americans, according to this survey, believe that. So, as the PRI points out, this is kind of frightening and scary, right? As I think they say in the article that 15% is like about the same size as white evangelicals. So they say something like this, QAnon is almost the size of like a major organized religion at this point. And I don't know if you have thoughts on that. I mean, I guess I take this survey with maybe like a bit of a grain of salt. And we should talk a little bit about conspiracy theory in general and why the US is such a ripe breeding ground for them. But any thoughts on QAnon just to kick it off?
Yeah, I share your slight skepticism over prescribing the accuracy of those results, and that I think these days people are pretty savvy about polling, and I think that's one of the reasons why polling has been very off on the last couple election cycles and things, and especially with these kind of more outlandish polls, I think people can sense what the question is kind of getting at, and you know what I mean, like in the sense that like they're asking them, oh, do you believe satanic pedophiles run the government? And on some level, the person like knows what's really behind that question. And you know what I mean? And they're like, oh, okay, I'll just answer yes, because fuck you guys.
Right.
You're just liberal media assholes and you're gonna, you know what I mean? So I think there's an element of that going on, and I find it very difficult to trust any polling, especially of the American right. Like where I just think that it's become kind of it's become a culture war tool, and as such, I think has lost a lot of its accuracy because people can see what is going on. But that being said, it is true that QAnon has way more, like just in my life, anecdotally, it has more people believe it than you would want to, you feel comfortable believing,
Right.
There is anecdotal evidence to suggest that a lot of people do believe this stuff. And I think you're right that, that conspiracy theory has always been kind of a particularly American thing. And I don't really have a strong theory as to why. I mean, I know this is not like anything particularly new, but yeah, I think, and it obviously increases dramatically in periods of inequality, social instability, lack of trust. I mean, look at the collapse in trust in all institutions. I mean, there's
the media,
collapse in trust, which is it's not something that happened with Trump. It's you look at the surveys starting in the 90s. I think Gallup has been doing a yearly kind of things for decades, and like starting around the early 90s, it just started to see a pretty steady decline. And so it's not like something that is necessarily driven by social, or like created by social media or the internet, or Trump especially. It's something that has been trending with the rest of the collapse in other institutions as well. And I think that on some level, the institutions have themselves to blame. I mean, the institutions have not done a good job. They're very bad record on the institutions.
Yeah, I mean, even when you look at the first, PRI question, like, do you believe the government is controlled by, an elite? The government, finance, and the media are controlled by an elite of like satanic pedophiles. It's like, well, they are controlled by elites. I don't know if the elites are all Satanists or all pedophiles, but I'm sure
a lot of them seem to be, though.
Exactly. Right. Exactly. Some of them seem to be. I mean, I'm sure like tons of people have pointed this out before, but if you just look at the like Jeffrey Epstein inner circle, I mean, what is that but inner circle of elites who are also pedophiles? So I guess that kind of brings me to like you were saying, I don't know that I have like a grand unified theory of why conspiracy theories are so American. But I guess what I'm getting at is I think part of the problem is the American political system has been so non-transparent. It's been so, secretive. There are actual assaults on democracy that are not just the Capitol riot, but, just run-of-the-mill voter disenfranchisement. Or you could even think about things like the influence of money in politics, and how that basically, by default, excludes a large group of people from political participation. The political system is rigged, as, our fave Bernie Sanders has always said. So it's not really much of a surprise that people kind of intuit that and then come up with these like outlandish explanations for lack of a better answer.
3 years ago, the Washington Post published something called the Afghanistan Papers, and it was an enormous bombshell that would have like rocked any society. Because basically what it said, the journalist got access to internal documents spanning from the beginning of the Afghanistan war through the end, basically, in which they just basically proved that the government was lying about literally everything about the war at all times, every single year, no matter who was in power, no matter what the hell they were doing, they were just lying about it all the time. And that kind of just a news item like that, it doesn't even register, because I think most people assume correctly that the institutions that govern their lives are unaccountable to them. They lie to them all the time. I mean, you don't even want to talk about Iraq, where like just based solely on lies, in which every structure of power, including the media, including the liberal media, like not just the right-wing insane media, all of it just kind of fell into lockstep to sell us this war that was all based on lies. And so how can you expect, I don't think that you can expect people in a society where that is just incredibly common, which also have, declining life expectancy, declining wages and job security, and all the things that social democracy brings to people, and expect them to trust anything. And so
Right.
I just, like, when people, when I have like zero patience for elites, when I'm talking to someone like in some high level media job or whatever, and they're like, can you believe these people like believe all these crazy things? And I'm like,
Yeah.
you believe all the insane shit you publish
Right.
like on in the New York Times, I don't know,
Right.
like all the time.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Like, look at yourself, like don't blame these people, like blame yourself, and then we can have a serious conversation.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think that, actually brings me to the other thing that I wanted to address before we get Bhaskar on, which is A, the opioid crisis, but B, just like the complete mess that our for-profit healthcare system is. Obviously, every Jacobin viewer like knows this by now, but there was a particularly interesting article in the New York Times. I believe it came out earlier this week, and it basically talked about how a lot of people who are unvaccinated right now are unvaccinated because they don't actually believe that the vaccine is free, right? They're afraid that they're going to get hit with a surprise bill.
Yeah.
I want to bring up one specific quote from the article. This is by a medical professional in California who says, about conversations that they have with their patients. The conversations we have are like, yes, I know it's good, meaning the vaccine. Yes, I want it, but I don't have insurance, said Ilan Shapiro, medical director of Altamed, a community health network in Southern California that serves a large Hispanic population. We're trying to make sure everyone knows it's free. Of course, the vaccine is free. It's supposed to be free. There's been a push to make sure that people know that. That said, testing was supposed to be free as well. And we know that lots of people got hit with surprise bills. Even just on the vaccine being free, like when I went to get it, it was free, but they asked for my insurance still. I don't know if you had that. Yeah, it was like really weird. I don't know what.
I thought about like not giving it to them.
Really? Yeah.
But then I was like worried because I got vaccinated like almost like as soon as I was eligible, kind of thing. And I was worried that if I didn't put my insurance, like I would get bumped, to another part. Like I had no idea. Because I was like, this is supposed to be free. Why do they need my insurance? Like, why?
Right. So even you, somebody with insurance who, obviously, got vaccinated without much of a hitch, had that moment where when they were asking for your insurance, and because of your experience, obviously, with our like deeply broken medical system, you were like, well, what should I do? I mean, I can, it's not a surprise, I guess is what I'm saying. And I bring this up in the context of, conspiracy theories and how they're sort of materially like homegrown, because I think there's this conception right now that, people who are unvaccinated are like stubborn somehow, or at worst are like wackos who like subscribe to some kind of anti-science, anti-vax, conspiracy theory. And to be sure, like, of course, there are tons of those people. There are tons of people who are just stubborn or whatever.
I know them well.
You've seen them.
Yeah.
But that said, it's like we now know that according to the Kaiser Family Foundation poll, we now know that at least a third of people who are unvaccinated have expressed some sort of misgiving about, whether or not it's actually free. And again, this goes back to our, broken healthcare system. I mean, what if we could just eliminate that seed of doubt by having a functioning single payer system,
Yeah, I mean, well, first of all, one thing I'll say is that according to health executives themselves, like they're like, it's free for now, like if you need to do booster shots or whatever, like they expect to make money eventually on the vaccine, because it's unclear whether, the 2 shots is enough. You might need a 3rd shot next year or maybe one up every year, and they expect to make money then.
Right. Right. Eventually down the line.
Yeah. But I mean, I do wonder if the flip side is, if we focus obviously on the negative, that's bad. But there probably are going to be millions of people who are going to get vaccinated for free. And I wonder if we could use that as a base for like, maybe we could just do like to convince people or talk to people as an organizational tool to be like, wouldn't it be nice if like all of this shit was free? Like they did it once. Like, why can't they do it again? You know, like,
remember when you showed up for the vaccine, it like actually worked well and was free. Like, think about that. Yeah, totally.
You could have that every day of your life.
I just want to say, as a personal anecdote, I got vaccinated in New York City at the Javits Center. I don't know if you know it, but it's basically this like
Yeah, where
massive.
Hillary Clinton broke the glass
Oh
ceiling.
God, yeah, it's true. It's true. The very
Yeah.
auditorium. Yeah, it's this
Yes.
massive like convention center that looks like an aquarium. And unlike anything else that has happened in New York during the pandemic, the vaccination rollout at the Javits Center actually went like extremely smoothly. Like lines were orderly, like the military was directing things, you know, like everything moved really quickly. And except for that moment where they were like, give me your insurance, which of course, you know, worked out for me. It was like completely seamless. And I was like, holy shit, I guess this is how like the medical system runs when, you know, things are centralized, things are like directed from above, and also nobody has to pay or like, you know, really fuck with their insurance.
Yeah. I mean, I'm originally from Spain. I remember, I mean, it's a joy to go to the doctor or even the pharmacy in Spain. You know, they're essentially like state licensed pharmacies. Like there's no branding. There's no like, you know, they all just have the same kind of generic green cross.
Medicine.
Yeah, it's like medicine, and you show up and like they have a more of an ability to prescribe than they do in the United States, the pharmacists themselves, which saves a lot of time. You just walk in there and they're like, okay, what's wrong with you? Okay, like your eye, what's going on? Okay, here, take this, and you know, and it's like, and then you go to pay and it's like 49 cents or something absurdly low. It's a dream. It's a dream when it works that way.
Yeah, for sure. But okay, speaking of prescriptions, I did also want to briefly touch on the opioid crisis. And the reason for that is because, number one, on the theme of conspiracy, the opioid crisis in the US is basically a real life conspiracy theory, right? I mean, when you look at what Purdue Pharma did, by which I mean not just manufacturing and you know, continuing and exacerbating the opioid crisis for profit, but then turning around and trying to patent the drug used to treat opioid addiction. I mean, again, like we were saying before, I mean, when you're faced with something that crazy, like, is it a surprise that people turn to other conspiracy theories, right?
I mean, and the Sackler family is actually, like, you know, initiated legal proceedings to protect themselves from any future prosecution or lawsuits as a result from this. It's, you know, like you said, it's a real life conspiracy.
So on that front, you know, I did want to share this news. I don't know if you guys have seen it, but there's another lawsuit pending against McKinsey, which of course is the evil consulting firm that worked with Purdue Pharma to kind of lobby and, you know, manufacture and spread opioids to distributors and pharmacies. I think one of the like well-known repulsive things that McKinsey did was coach Purdue on how to respond to messages from parents whose children had died of opioid addiction. They were like, well, what if we talked about how like these pills really help people with pain? And it's just like, so, you know, McKinsey, if you guys remember earlier this year, was already the subject of a lawsuit and I think settled for something like 600 million with all 50 states, or 600 million was the total amount that they settled with all 50 states. But that does not prevent, you know, cities and I guess counties from filing their own suits. So New York City and a couple different counties in New York recently filed yet another suit against McKinsey. Hope that they are able to wring some more money out of them. And, you know, when I was reading about this, I also came across a news story about how the opioid crisis, unsurprisingly, had gotten worse during the pandemic. You know, I don't think this comes as much of a shock, but I hadn't heard that much about it. And I was actually talking to my boyfriend about it, and he was like, no, I didn't hear anything about it. Actually, I thought the opioid crisis was on the wane. But I want to play a quick clip from CBS. This is a doctor at Harvard University's Public Health School, and he talks a little bit about it.
This is, of course, you know, an incredibly important public health crisis that has come along with COVID. Some people are calling them twin pandemics that have collided with one another. I want to point out that before 2020, we went into the COVID pandemic with an out-of-control public health crisis of addiction. 2019 actually had been the worst year on record for opioid overdoses up until that point. And there are indications that 2020, even without a pandemic, would have been terrible as well. However, during the pandemic, as all of us have experienced, add the stress of the pandemic, extreme isolation, job loss, and you really have a perfect storm for addiction to flourish. And add that on top of the fact that mental health problems, largely due to these factors, exploded during the pandemic. And you have huge increases in the number of Americans reporting symptoms of anxiety and depression. And all of these are issues that can either lead people to addiction or worsen addiction in those who might be predisposed.
So, like I said, really tragic, also not that much of a surprise. The reason why I wanted to bring this up is because, again, the seeds of the opioid crisis are, of course, in this completely evil, as we were saying, real life conspiracy between Purdue Pharma, McKinsey, and other, pharmaceutical companies who kind of engineered the crisis for profit. But also, we just completely do not have any kind of support for people who are dealing with addiction. Again, let's not even get into the kind of broken healthcare system. There's just nothing. As the doctor was saying, when you have a mental health crisis, whether it is brought on by the pandemic or something else, that those factors are only going to collide and make things worse.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at something like the Sackler family and their evil, which they are horrific, evil, just absolute vampires, just the worst people maybe on the planet. If you did the thing and you went back in time and killed, how you can kill baby Hitler now? If you went back in time and killed, well, if you did that, it wouldn't matter because someone else would just do it. Because when you have a for-profit health system and there's something like opioids and there's money to be made off of this highly addictive, dangerous thing, and it's legal, someone's gonna do it. You can kill all the Sacklers tomorrow, and then there'll be some other evil family and some other evil corporation who will do the same thing, because that's just fundamentally what happens when you use profit in something like health. It's something that is completely at odds with the goals of public health, with the goals of helping people. It's just incompatible with profit. So as long as you have that, you're gonna have the Sacklers of the world. And it's just, and the opioid epidemic is one of the most, it's one of the most depressing things in our country right now. It's the fact that we're the only developed country that has a declining life expectancy, and it's driven largely by these deaths of despair, both alcoholism, suicide, and opioids, or a combination of all three. It just shows you how sick our society is, and how much people are struggling, that it's the impulse to sort of complicate that narrative, that it's not just the fact that we don't have things like a public health system, that we don't have job security, that we don't have rising wages, that we don't have, all these things that give people stability in their lives. And it's mind-boggling to me that people try to obfuscate that narrative, because it's just so obvious. Okay, the pandemic happens, people are stressed, people lose their jobs. There's all this kind of course, opioid addictions are going to go up.
Right. Yeah, to follow from that, I was thinking earlier about how, a few years ago, when there kind of started to be these sort of more mainstream, attention to the opioid crisis, a very common liberal narrative, I think, was oh, you're already making the liberal face.
It's white people.
Exactly. It's
That's
white
why
people.
You care
right?
about it.
Right. Exactly. There was comparisons of, the opioid crisis to, the crack crisis in the 80s, where, people would point out, well, when we had the crack problem, because it was Black people, the, punitive fist of the state came down, and people were thrown into jail, and nobody called it a public health crisis. All true. The broad contours of that kind of narrative, I suppose, are true. But as we can see from the statistics that we just shared, what we've just been talking about, I don't actually think that most of the victims of the opioid crisis or their families have been treated well. You know what I mean?
No.
Yeah.
No. No, and I don't know. I'm sure there's plenty of white people who are in jail for running meth labs or whatever. To cite a white drug.
Yeah, I'm from Idaho. There are.
plenty of meth labs, right? And plenty of people in jail for them. Yeah, I mean, it's. I hate that liberal impulse to identify like a racial injury, and then the prescription is we got to bring everyone down. You know, like everyone's got to suffer the same bad thing. You know, like that we just have to distribute racial pain equally rather than just kind of like mitigate the harm and get everyone up to the level of everyone else. I mean, it's so obvious, but like that's not the impulse because of a lack of class consciousness and a class analysis. Like people look at like a poor white person and think like, ew, they're bad, they're disgusting. You know, they don't see that their fates are tied with them. I mean, that was an interesting thing when I was researching the piece in which I cited your article, Jen, that all these anti-racist training, what are the effects that, I mean, it doesn't mitigate racial biases. One thing it does increase though is class antagonism.
Right.
You know, the people who take them are like,
it makes middle class people less sympathetic to poor white people, which like, congrats. I don't know. Like, well, I think on that note, maybe we should bring out the man of the hour, Bhaskar Sunkara. Everybody, you know him as the editor and publisher of Jacobin. Bhaskar, you're the editor of Jacobin, and you're now on the Jacobin Show, and I can't figure out if that makes you our most important guest so far or the least remarkable. But in any case, we're happy to have you.
The one who pays the bills, baby. He pays the bills. He's the most important one.
No, I'm the fill-in. Actually, I demanded a certain amount of time to talk about, you know, various musings, my thoughts on evolution, you know, whatever else. Actually, right as we were coming on, like when I was in the waiting room or wherever, backstage in StreamYard, I was looking at this plan that Muammar Gaddafi came up with for the partition of Switzerland.
Friend of the show.
Friend of the show, Muammar Gaddafi. Certainly judge him by the ones who came after, but he came up with a plan to just partition Switzerland. And this is like 2008. Like this is fairly recently.
Hell yeah.
He was going to divide it up between France, Italy, and Germany on linguistic lines. And I wasn't sure if he was like making a point about European colonialism in Africa or something, or whether like they had just frozen his Swiss bank account and he was pissed. So I don't know the context.
You think Gaddafi was doing an elaborate conceptual provocation?
Yeah, maybe it was like an art piece from Gaddafi. But anyway,
well, you know, I was going to say, so we're having you on to talk about social democracy. I think that's your second favorite topic. The first, of course, being basketball.
And that is I was very vague about what my important hard out was. I was kind of insinuating to Kale there was a family matter, but in fact, I just need to get home from the Jackman office where I am now to watch the Knicks game. So
you know, hopefully you're not alone in, you know, among the Jacobin viewers. There could be some other basketball fans out there. So we did promise Bhaskar and other Knicks fans that there would be a hard stop before the game.
Please, absolutely. So Autumn Leaves is a Nets fan. I hope that's a joke. That was one of my favorite YouTube commentators. You know, it's a low bar on YouTube, but we tend to have a few good ones. But wow, that's tough.
Bhaskar already sparring with the commentators. Welcome back to
Autumn. Are you from New Jersey? Because that would make it justifiable if you have some sort of New Jersey connection. I feel like they're allowed to be Nets fans. Anyway, sorry.
Anyway, social democracy.
Yes.
So I think actually, Bhaskar, I want to start just by kind of getting like a working definition down. And the reason why I want to do that is because I think, you know, in the US at least, the sort of double campaigns of Bernie Sanders opened the door to more widespread interest in a battery of social programs that I think we commonly associate with social democracy, right? So nationalized healthcare, something we talked about on the show earlier, you know, free public higher education, greater financial support for parents, redistribution of wealth, so on and so forth. And of course, when Bernie was running, he famously calls himself a democratic socialist, and a lot of people referred to his policies that way. I think that he referred to Denmark and other Nordic states as social or as democratic socialist a couple of different times. And, you know, there is a difference between social democracy and democratic socialism. And I think for the purposes of the Bernie campaign and for like 99% of American politics, like it's not really that important to like split that hair. But just set us up with a working definition, just so we can, kind of kick off. What is social democracy and what is it not?
So there's many different definitions of social democracy that breaks down the different types of social democracy. What I would say for the purposes of your question is that if you want a simple way to differentiate between, let's say, communism, our vision of democratic socialism or socialism, and social democracy, I would say that social democracy was the attempt to give us doses of socialism within capitalism. Or that's what ultimately it ended up doing, even though it initially aspired to do something else. Communism, in a sense, or the socialist bloc, the actually existing socialism, was an attempt to build a socialist bloc outside of capitalism, then maybe outcompete it or find some way to supersede it from that position of being outside capitalism. Again, that wasn't initially the what communists were trying to do. They were trying to foment revolution everywhere, but that's in essence what the system ended up being. And then democratic socialism, or our vision of socialism, is a socialism after capitalism. Then I would say that the mass movements that came out of the Second International diverged into two different camps, these communist camps and these social democratic camps. I don't see the democratic socialist road being different than the social democratic road. I just see it as one that goes further. So in other words, if a social democracy is able to give workers tremendous power over a capitalist political economy through mass trade unions, through decommodify, taking certain rights like healthcare out of the market, through the power of these really big unions and centralized wage bargaining and all sorts of other things, then what democratic socialism does is that it goes a step further and it questions the right of managers to manage. It asks, why do we not just have better wages and conditions and this welfare state under capitalism? Why can't we ask questions of ownership and questions of industrial democracy as well? So that's a simple definition. But when I think of social democracy, I'm not thinking about just any old welfare state. I'm in particular thinking about the experience of systems built by social democratic parties. So I'm thinking about Sweden, and I'm thinking about other Northern European states.
Can you talk about how social democracy came to be? Because there was a time where social democracy was the thing. It was like across the Western democracies, it was like hegemonic. And, that seems like in our current moment of crisis, it just doesn't seem like it's on the horizon. So maybe if we understood how it came to be out of previous crises, we could help maybe build it now.
Well, the common narrative, which you hear among both liberals and conservatives and some radicals too.
I'm ready for a hot take. I can't wait for the uncommon narrative. Let's get it.
Well, the common narrative is often like, it was like a rich white country that exploited the global South, and they had social solidarity because they were white, and they exploited the global South. The great Finnish Navy was just conquering all of these countries in the global South or whatever. But in reality, these were incredibly poor and unequal countries, violently unequal. So Sweden, by many measures, was the most unequal country in Europe next to Russia, and with a very violent tradition of class struggle. So it did have certain unique characteristics, one of which was that it was a late industrializer. So you have this working class emerge in Sweden, and it emerges alongside really big industrial unions. So there weren't tiny sectoral craft unions that we had. They didn't slowly go from artisans to workers. Very rapidly, this relatively advanced working class comes along. And then also because of some unique features, like they had very modern agriculture. So they didn't have a traditional peasantry. They had a relatively progressive, at least in a Marxist sense, class of farmers instead. So you do have this unique background and conditions, but it's the organization of the workers' movement, both the political wing of Swedish workers organized into the Socialist Workers' Party, the SAP. In English, we often call it just the Swedish Social Democratic Party. Then you have them organized economically in the shop floor, these same workers, into the LO, this big centralized trade federations. It's composed of the many different unions at the enterprise level. And the first battle is the battle for political democracy. So it's not just a parliamentary battle of trying to get people elected. It's in fact a battle to democratize the political system itself. And this is extremely, extremely violent. There's lots of people dead. There's class conflict. There's all sorts of a fear of the red flag flying over Stockholm. And eventually, democracy is won. And then after that, the battle becomes, okay, how do we make good on our promise of social and economic democracy? And starting in the 1930s, sometimes governing alone and sometimes in coalition with either the Agrarian Party, this centrist party, mostly with a rural base in this progressive farmer class that I mentioned, and also with the Communist Party at times. Swedish Social Democrats rule their country for 50 to 60 years, nearly without stop. So from the early 1930s until 1976, they're in power basically continuously, and then they're back in power in the 1980s. So they have a very, very long time to cement a new sort of political regime. And at first, there's a lot of thought that, what does it mean to be a social democrat? What's your alternative to capitalism? And for a lot of the parties of the Second International, it was just nationalization. We didn't really know how, but we just knew, okay, we would use the power of the state. We would take over factories. Workers would run them to various degrees of worker control. And we'll figure out a way through parliamentary means to take power, then to administer an economy. And in practice, we found that even though nationalization can work, when it comes to the big commanding heights of the economy, you nationalize your rail, you can nationalize your health service, you can do all sorts of things like that, key natural resources, mining, whatever. It didn't really make sense and didn't really work for other spheres. So very early on, the Swedes moved from that model, but they still don't want to just let capitalists do whatever they want. They want to shape the pattern of investment and the pattern of Swedish development in a more egalitarian way. So they end up creating a system that uses the power of this trade union that has, basically 80, 90+% of the working class under its banner to do what's called, it's centralized wage bargaining. It's slightly different than sectoral wage bargaining, but the basics of it was we would push for equal pay for equal work across sectors. And we would try to reward the most efficient producing manufacturers and weed out the least efficient one, and then make the most efficient ones pay us and shape their investment to this higher wage model that we want for our country. And then, of course, we would tax the hell out of those capitalists after the fact, beyond making them pay high wages because of the bargaining power of workers. The state would tax the hell out of them. And we would create this big public sector with more and more social guarantees. So it's a very long-winded answer, but the bottom line is that it comes to politics and organizing and has very little to do with culture. But certainly there were a few fortuitous things about Swedish development that made it easier for them to pursue that path. Like in the US, we had, for white males at least, we had democracy. So we had party allegiance before we had a modern working class. So American workers loved Eugene Debs. They loved him like or the Catholics ones at least, loved the Pope, right? He was like a figure of moral authority. He wasn't, they weren't the party, So I won't bring up, hey, I'm with this Pope. I'm fine with this Pope. You give me a good center-left Pope and I can ignore many of the horrible things your institution has done, Nando. But you give me another Nazi one, and I might
turn on the church.
Yeah, exactly.
For the record, I'm not really Catholic. I don't give a shit. So, just for the record.
Wow, you were hired to be the token Catholic.
Catholic representation,
Yeah, the Catholic community.
Letters from the Vatican. Yeah,
and we thought you were Latino too. It's like
I know that's a big problem. That's a big problem.
But okay, so Bhaskar, to turn to the U.S. context, I think we've talked about this with different guests on the Jacobin Show before. But I think one of the kind of overarching narratives that you alluded to about why social democracy never really cohered in the and B, I wonder if you can comment on this idea of the New Deal being kind of like the American version of social democracy. I mean, does it make sense to think about it like that? What you're saying about kind of these political formations and political parties makes a lot of sense. But the U.S., of course, did have a pretty robust workers' movement leading up to the New Deal. So how does that all fit in?
Yeah, what I would say is that the U.S. definitely had a history of quite violent class struggle. There's an entire book that I advise people check out called Dynamite. That's in part about how the major tool of U.S. class struggle for a lot of American workers, especially in the Western states, was in fact that they were meant to clear, giant mountains and passes for development and for railroads and whatever else. So the bosses gave us dynamite. And when workers were pissed off, they would toss that dynamite into the boss's living quarters. I mean, that was part of class struggle in the U.S. It was very rough, and it was very difficult to organize, obviously, across a continent. I would say that race and ethnic division does matter, right? It did make it, that along with geographical disparities, did make it difficult to organize the working class compared to in places where the working class was highly centralized in a few cities and a few places with greater levels of commonalities, even at the level of like language, at a whole host of things. So you could say that the Socialist Party in the US was the mass party of Jewish garment workers in the Lower East Side. And probably also some workers in the mining industry in Nevada and some workers in pockets of Oklahoma. But we had an entire continent with workers in different fields and again, speaking different languages, with different backgrounds, with different experiences. And that obviously played a role. But the best comparison, this is made by Robin Archer in a book called Why There's No Labor Party in the US, is comparing the US to Australia. So you have another country that's very divided along ethnic lines. You have another country with this huge geography that's like quote unquote underpopulated in the sense you have workers just dispersed over this huge settler colony. And you have a lot of the same tensions, yet Australian workers were able to create a labor party. I think that the U.S. being an early industrializer that also had already had existing party loyalties really worked to our negative advantage. So we couldn't do like the Swedish workers did and assemble this young new working class that's already very concentrated to go fight for political democracy. And in a way, because American workers weren't excluded, at least white workers weren't excluded from the major parties, we didn't have the same level of the same need to form particularly working class institutions in the civic arena, even though we were forming them in the economic arena as far as trade unions. But, I think there were certain times in U.S. history, in the 1890s, maybe, for example, when we could have formed a mass-based labor party, where the Populist Party maybe could have been the political spark behind such a formation or an evolution. But instead, what we ended up with was a series of small, largely politically based organizations, like the Socialist Party and later the Communist Party, that at best acted as pressure groups onto the dominant parties, in particular the Democratic Party. So I think it is true that the New Deal that emerged and the New Deal coalition afterwards, especially by the late 40s or mid 40s, became something like a social democratic party within a party. Like labor was incorporated within that tent. We got mass unionization. We got a certain level of representation for the U.S. working class. We just happened to get it within a capitalist party and without the levers of control that the UK Labour Party had or the Australian Labour Party had, much less these much more radical and Marxist mass parties like the Swedish Workers' Party.
Speaking of the New Deal, what do you make of the narrative that has become pretty dominant amongst liberals, but even some people on the left, that the New Deal was actually problematic, that it was racist?
Well, I think it is kind of, what's funny about that line of thinking is that people don't stop to think, well, for people obsessed with like lived experiences and whatever else, like the actual experiences of Black workers in the 1930s was they had for a generation supported the Republican Party as a party of Lincoln, the party of emancipation. Then they were massively realigned by the administration of FDR and by the New Deal. So if the New Deal was a net negative to I'm being upstaged. If the New Deal was a net negative for Black workers, then there wouldn't have been this mass realignment, right? There wouldn't have been this transformation. I think also there's some exclusions when people talk about the New Deal that weren't necessarily exclusions on the basis of race. For example, the Social Security exclusion, which is almost always cited as a particularly race-based exclusion, in fact, impacted more white workers than it impacted Black workers. It did disproportionately impact Black workers, but again, the negative impact was to people at the lower rung of the labor market, and the sectors that pushed for it, the textile industries and people who employed domestic laborers and whatnot. These were sectors that were primarily concerned about an uptick in wages and wage costs in very labor intensive sectors. So I think it's really important to just study the history and understand why the New Deal was so bad where it was bad, while still understanding that it was a net positive for American workers. And then obviously there are things in the New Deal suite of policies, particularly around housing and redlining and whatnot, and actions by local and state governments that are explicitly racialized and were negative. But on the whole, it's important to understand it in context. And again, I think we also need to think about what we're talking to the public about, how we're presenting our politics to the public. So if we keep saying to the public, we want a Green New Deal is great, but then we also say, by the way, the New Deal is bad and racist. Well, why do we call our new thing the Green New Deal then? You know, it seems very confusing.
The green, non-racist New Deal.
Yeah, exactly. It just really, I think it's bad politics. So
the New Deal checked its privilege, and now it did some work. It is, yeah.
Yeah. I want to quickly shout out Touré Reed's book, Toward Freedom. If anybody watching missed our episode with Touré Reed, you can watch that. But also his book is so good. Go check that out if you're interested in kind of piecing through some of the specifics that Bhaskar just mentioned on the New Deal.
Yeah, no, it's fantastic. And also there's a Catalyst essay that he wrote as well. That's on that topic broadly that is not behind a paywall, I think. So you should check it out.
You would know.
Sure. Yeah, we in general with Jacobin, no paywall. With Catalyst, it's it's a boutique product. It's for the aspiring scholars out there. Academic publishing, it's an ugly game. But yeah, I mean, I just think it is just strange. Like, people like FDR in general, to the extent there is a historic memory of the New Deal. They like the New Deal and they like the FDR because they think he was egalitarian and because he demanded rights for working people. Yeah. Obviously, the historical record is, I think that's broadly right, but it's complicated. I think it's especially complicated for anti-capitalists who might have rather something else happen. Like I would rather miss one term of FDR, but maybe at least try and fail to construct a labor party. Like I wish the Ruther brothers did that in the 40s or whatever else. So it is a bit complicated, but it's like when you're presenting something to the public, when Bernie Sanders makes a speech, I would say a major international, very famous publication commissioned me, go down to DC, write something on Bernie Sanders' speech. And then I wrote something on his big socialism speech in George Washington University, and he's standing in front of like 29 flags. He's trying to drive home, but giving his vision of socialism. And he does cite Debs, and he does use a lot of like workerist language about exploitation and stuff like that, which is great. But he also invokes primarily FDR and the four freedoms, right? And the unfinished kind of second Bill of Rights to guarantee us positive economic rights in addition to the negative rights guaranteed in the original founding Bill of Rights. And essentially my editors of this publication were looking for something that said, no, Bernie isn't a real socialist. He's just a New Deal Democrat. Here's a real socialist take on that, which I thought was really funny that like these liberal editors were ostensibly like wanted a critique, a radical critique of Bernieism and FDR isms, when in fact, when you're living in the US of 2019 and 2020, like that sounds pretty good as a starting point for more radical, transformations down the road.
Yeah. So since we're on the subject of FDR, maybe let's skip forward to our new FDR, Biden. No, I'm just kidding. But I mean, I do want to talk about Biden, right? Because, he has made some gestures toward sort of reversing the tide of austerity. He, post-COVID has sort of loosened some of the purse strings. He has inaugurated kind of unprecedented for many decades social spending. I believe he just announced a $6 trillion budget, which of course includes funding for all kinds of things like, parental leave, childcare. Again, programs that sound or look very much like some of the programs that even our friend Bernie was advocating when he was on the stump. So I guess the question is, what do you make of Biden in this moment? Is there, I know that we're all skeptical of Biden, but is there some kind of promise or some kind of shift that's positive in what you see coming from Biden these days?
Well, I think it's certainly better than Trump, right? And no, I think that, that doesn't completely go without saying, I think on the left. I think there is a host of I think that what Biden's offering us is basically a new type of fiscal liberalism. Like he is responding to a certain moment of crises, a moment when the economy is in a slump in part because of COVID and the lockdowns. And now it's time for a little bit of money to get things going again. And then while we're at it, while we're spending money, let's try to fix these other longstanding social issues. And I definitely think that's progress. And it's a push against a certain austerian logic that I think held within even the Democratic Party for a period in the 80s and 90s. Biden himself was leading the charge, a bipartisan charge, was with him and basically a bunch of Republican senators pushing for hard entitlement reforms in the 1980s. He even used that rhetoric as recently as during the Obama administration when he was vice president. Now it seems like we're past that type of austerity, or at least that's not on the table today. But I think what Biden's offering is more money, not necessarily anything structural. So if you look at his main structural priorities, the things he said he would get done to improve the economy in the long run in some sort of very serious way for working people, the PRO Act, which hasn't passed, and a $15 minimum wage. So in a country without centralized bargaining, a $15 minimum wage is kind of the way we do our centralized bargaining. Actually, in the Nordic countries, the unions and progressives are actually against a minimum wage because it kind of undermines the bargaining power of unions and the normally much higher sectoral wage. But in the US, it's a way for us to say, okay, this is the minimum workers should get paid. Weak producers who can't afford to pay this minimum should go out of business. Efficient producers who can will stay in business. And in general, maybe you should invest in higher value-added things for U.S. workers to do if you can't just sweat us at $8 or $9 an hour in the most inefficient ways possible. So American workers are more productive than most workers around the world, but that's not necessarily because we are using the best technology or utilizing our skills the best, just because we work really, really long hours. So there's all sorts of structural things you could do with that. And then obviously the PRO Act would kind of a last gasp for labor to figure out how to increase its density and exert more of a role in the economy, advocating for the interests of working people. Those things have not passed. What has passed is an injection of cash. And it seems like that injection of cash is just a one-time thing that happened because the Democrats won a couple of seats and they were able to do it through budget reconciliation. And given the patterns of elections, normally the incumbent party loses in midterm elections. So what happens if the Democratic majority becomes even more narrow or is completely lost? Potentially, like, can you imagine this happening again? And what would have been left from it? The Trump's CARES Act under Trump was also a very sweeping piece of legislation when it comes to the sectors of the economy that it touched. So I think these things are definitely welcomed. I think it's going to improve the lives of millions of people. It's cash in people's pockets that is objectively having an impact. There is less despair. There is going to be less deaths of despair. I think as long as until the pump goes dry. I think the Biden administration has done a very good job pushing against claims that these policies are excessively inflationary. There's a host of things that I think are being done well, but to me, it's not a structural shift at all. It's just budgetary liberalism.
So then how do we get out of this kind of situation that we're in? Because it feels like since 2008 and probably even since before, where there's no real political change to speak of that's really meaningful. It just kind of everything seems kind of stuck. And then since 2008, we've been living in this kind of very strange, prolonged economic crisis. I mean, we have this weird situation now where there's like all these bubbles all over the place, it seems like, and when they eventually pop, they're probably going to be the government's probably going to step in and bail everyone out. But like seems like we're in a kind of both stuck but also in a perpetual state of crisis, and it feels like no one's heart is really in it, like that no one really believes the system anymore. So like what is the way out?
Well, I would say that I think there's a sense of crisis. There's a sense of crisis in part because for working class people, life really hasn't been getting much better in a relative sense. But at the level of the economy as a whole, I actually think the U.S. is a growing, dynamic economy that's incredibly productive and still profitable and still has a lot of room left to go. And I don't mean that to be a cheerleader for the U.S., because what I'm actually saying is that
spoken like a true small business owner.
Yeah, right. All we need is a little bit of help, to get the government off my back. But you should see our water bill here at the Jacobin office. Actually, the favored candidate of some parts of the left had a little scandal where she bribed a New York City water official about a decade ago. And hey, I can understand. I wouldn't do it, but I can understand. But no, I think that the thing is the economy is working, but the economy working doesn't benefit the majority of people in that economy necessarily, right? At some level it does, because if it wasn't doing well and your firms were out of business or weren't profitable enough to stay in business, then there'd be more unemployment, and that would be a social disaster for everyone. But workers need the ability to bargain for higher wages. And right now, temporarily, we're finding a way to do it just because of unemployment benefits and because of money from the government and stimulus, allowing more people, and in general, fairly low unemployment rates or very low unemployment rates, allowing people to say F off to bad bosses and try to find new work. But we need this in a more institutional way. We need this at a structural level. We need stronger trade unions in this country. But besides for that, I don't really have a doom and gloom perspective on the U.S. And yes, there are lots of different bubbles. I think the housing bubble seems like it's becoming one of them. There's obviously the rampant speculation in crypto and things like that. I think that in general, though, when we think about capitalism, instead of looking for crises, like I think Marxists traditionally do. I tend to think about how stable the system is and the mechanism of that system's stability. So crises are more the exception than the rule, and also mass collective action and workers' movements and workers being successful, trying to push against the imperatives of capital. Those are the exceptions rather than the rules, because everything is stacked in favor of capitalists. You know, capitalists, of course, need our labor, working class people's labor collectively. But as individuals, we need our grocery money more than any capitalist needs our labor. And it's that asymmetrical dependency that I think is really the key feature of our life. And that's why even as the economy grows, even as the world and the country becomes more prosperous, things feel so awful because of that precarity underlying the lives of each and every working people. And even if you think you're middle class and you think things are going well, you know, you're just one or two missed paychecks away from, you know, utter despair and destitution. And in most places in the country, you know, you could be served an eviction notice like that, you know, 6-7 days after you're late on your rent. You know, you just don't have these rights and you don't have the safety net. And again, for leftists, I think, who look at FDR or look at the safety net and see it as a mixed blessing, let's say, because it's stabilizing the system that we want to destroy. I mean, it becomes very difficult to have an agent that will destroy the system if that agent is so worried about survival on the day-to-day. You know, workers who are facing unemployment do not revolt, and they don't have the capacity to revolt. It's not because they don't like their situation.
But I guess that brings up another question, which is social democracy stable?
I think that social democracy is inherently unstable in the sense that what social democracy does is it gives workers more and more power to make wage demands and eventually demands over working conditions. But it does so in an economy that's still fundamentally dependent on private capitalist investment. So at some point, if you're a Swedish capitalist, you could say, all right, in the 40s and 50s and 60s, I'm liking things in Sweden, or I'm okay with things in Sweden. I have to deal with these powerful unions, but in general, I have more industrial peace, so there's less strikes than the UK and France. So I might be making less money year over year than I would in the good years in those other countries, but at least it's steady and it's stable and it's better than nothing. But what happens when the workers start making demands that go beyond, that changes your ability to manage, your ability to restructure production? What happens when you're hit by global crises and you're trying to figure out your profitability is declining, yet at the same time the wage demands are the same, or if even going higher? Does it make sense for you to double down and invest whatever profits you have into expanding production? Or does it make sense to just hold on to your money until climate changes, or maybe invest overseas or somewhere else? So I think there is this inherent instability. And I think there's always the risk of going too far for capitalism, but not far enough for socialism. It's inherent in social democracy. I think we're very far in the United States from reaching the structural limits of social democracy. And also, I think that the social rights that were won, capitalists have found it very difficult to decay them in places where they were won. So even though we might have seen less new welfare rights being constructed in European social democracies or in welfare states across the world, in Japan and elsewhere, after the 1970s and early 80s, what rights were won, capitalists have found it very hard to erode. And in part because of the aging population of a lot of these advanced capitalist countries, they're in fact spending more a percentage of their GDP on social welfare than at previous points in history. Of course, I don't mean to say the social democracy is stronger now, like Lane Kenworthy and some others might, than it was in the 1970s and early 80s. Because of that fact, I think it's far weaker, and the bargaining power of workers is far weaker. I'm just saying that it's not fully like Sisyphus, and that's how Rosa Luxemburg described reforms under capitalism. The boulder goes down, but it doesn't go down all the way. The real question is, how do we then renew the fight for more expansive demands. And I don't think we have to go through the whole process of slowly, at the same speed, rolling the boulder up the hill. I think there's going to be certain moments of revolutionary feelings, of changes in consciousness, when people can make huge advances in a short period of time. But I do think that if you do not have the class power to give people Medicare for all and a $15 minimum wage, and you can't figure out how to organize workers behind those popular demands, then we won't have the class power to think about ownership of the means of production and those sorts of questions. So they definitely go hand in hand. And I'm definitely all for putting forward those questions of ownership and democracy sooner. But to me, the roads aren't the same. I once used this analogy, actually didn't go well, but I'll try it again. Where it's like you're on a football field and you know, and social democracy got the ball to the 30-yard line and was inching closer to the red zone, but decided to kick a field goal on like a 4th and 1. But it's socialism is a touchdown, but it's the same field. It's the same field, you know. This is the glory of this is live television, guys.
When continuing that analogy, was there ever a moment when it looked like social democracy could, you know, throw a 30-yard pass into the corner of the end zone and get the full 6 points? And if not, why did they kick the field goal?
Well, I think it was. You could look at the radicalization of social democracy in the period between 1968 and the mid-1970s. And you'll see the social democratic parties, far from being bought off by the welfare state, like a lot of Leninists thought they would be, these social democrats were actually emboldened. And young workers and students and others were really fighting to question the perimeters of the system. So in Sweden, part of this grand compromise in which the Employer Federation, which is a highly centralized body and kind of the parallel body to the LO, the Trade Union Association, ended up breaking the compact that said that, you know, you'll have to submit to this new regime of accumulation, but we won't bother you your right to manage on the shop floor. Young radical workers started breaking that compact and started pushing for industrial democracy in 68 onward. And in order to solve both a practical economic crisis that was growing and also for ideological reasons, there was the attempt to create these wage earner funds that would slowly use workers' earning power, what they were earning at their firms, and would give them a percentage of their firm every year until some point in the future, maybe 15, 20 years, they would become majority owners through these wage earner funds controlled by the working class itself of their firms. So it was an attempt to enact the transition from social democracy to socialism, which was, of course, thwarted. I think the largest strikes in Swedish history, largest mass demonstrations, wasn't against the Iraq War or anything else. I think it was in the early 1980s, and it was against the Meidner Plan. So for various reasons, they lost the middle class. They lost some of the white-collar trade unions behind this, too. There was a big propaganda offensive against it. That was a step too far. But there was a similar radicalization across social democracy. The youth wing of the German Social Democratic Party in the 1970s, which by then had become a very conservative party, swung way to the far left. There was obviously May 68, but even after that, the Common program of the French socialists and the French communists, which took power in the early 1980s, was quite radical. The Greek left took power around then. The fight for democratic rights in places like South Korea and Spain and Portugal all had wings that were fighting for that to be also part of a socialist transformation too. So you have this period of intense radicalization. And what the third way social democrats did, I think this is crucial for people to remember. Sometimes when we think about third way social democrats, we think about Gordon Brown, we think about Tony Blair, and we're like, these are odious, disgusting people. They're personally, weak or whatever else. And I think in the case of Tony Blair, it's basically right. Gordon Brown, I have a small soft spot for because he was once at least a good trade unionist, and he has a Scottish accent. But Tony Blair, horrendous guy. Not a fan of the show. But I really do think that it can't be that in every single social democratic party across the world, there was just a generation of weak, terrible leaders who weren't committed to social democracy. And that's how we got neoliberalism. In fact, the gambit of a lot of these parties, the right wing of these parties, was we are going to allow capital to do what it has to do to restore profitability because we are reliant as people who run a capitalist state on profitable firms, so we have something to tax. But while weakening unions and weakening some regulations and rolling back some of the welfare state to allow this new regime of accumulation, we're going to retain part of our welfare state by taxing them, then by having this our core welfare state, our national health service in the case of the UK, and our core other parts of our welfare state be protected. And that was the gambit of third way social democracy. So I guess that would be something like kicking the field goal, but really I guess it was more like punting for field position, maybe. But it ended up backfiring because they undermined their own social base, and now workers don't see a difference between them and the right wingers, and they don't like them on cultural grounds and other things, and they won't vote for them. So they ended up undermining their own social base. So it was like a little bit like too clever by half, kind of.
So Bhaskar, in the spirit of Nick's fandom, this I think is going to be our last question for you, and it's a little bit broad / open-ended, and you've touched on a little bit of it already, but I want to know what you think a successful or a successful transition from social democracy to socialism could look like. And then maybe a follow-up question. Kale reminded us that the late, great Leo Panitch said, at one point that in the 21st century, it might be possible or even necessary to just skip over social democracy and move towards something approaching socialism. What do you make of that?
So on Leo's question, I would say that I think it's necessary. And I had a great long interview with Leo from January of 2020. And we got to some of these questions. I think it's necessary for us to immediately bring up questions of ownership and democracy right away. So I think under social democracy, we need to be pushing for worker co-ops. And I know participatory budgeting is kind of like a liberal, ridiculous thing, but the concept of having more active public involvement in assemblies about the economy and about how money is spent and what the public sector does with its money and all sorts of other questions, I think is really important. So I think we need to incorporate this plank, and we need to foster this kind of activity in civil society, and we need to use this as a measure to fight against the bureaucratization of our parties. Ultimately, a lot of these social democratic parties became incredibly parliamentarian and incredibly electoralist, and they end up undermining their own social base and demobilizing their rank and file. So their most talented members of the rank and file just were trying to get government jobs, not necessarily for bad or opportunistic reasons, but just because that was their avenue to politics. And workers were basically just told, yeah, thank you for building this movement and this party. Just come out and vote every couple of years for us. That's your role. So you lost some of that richness and that depth and that rootedness in civil society. So it used to be if you went to a working class area really anywhere across the advanced capitalist world, you knew that area was an area generally voting for either a center left or a far left party. If you were in the streets of Bologna, you would be like, okay, this is the working class. This is a working class area. These are the major industries that employ these people. And these people are either voting for the Italian Socialist Party, the Italian Communist Party. Maybe some of them are Christian Democrats, but that's a minority. And for those of us on the radical left, it would be easy for us to say, okay, well, we are revolutionary socialists. We just need to convince these people who are committed programmatically to a slow, cautious road to socialism to take the leap and join us in a radical rupture towards socialism. It was very easy. I think our task is a bit more elementary. We need to reconstruct that working class culture and sense of being and connection to politics. So we need to have this rootedness, and our project is a project of class reformation. Now, the way I think you go about this process of reformation is organizing its activism, and I think its broad-based demands around our most popular issues, like a job guarantee, like Medicare for all, like a host of other things. So I think you need to lead with the social democratic demands. Now, once the party takes power, I definitely hope we can pursue a more radical road than the road of just 50 years of somewhat halting advance. And I hope that we can look for ruptures, but yeah, I don't think the social democratic demands part can be skipped. And I think actually talking to people and talking about what they want and how they think politics can improve their lives is really, really important for us. And that's why I'm both a socialist who spends a lot of time thinking about Tanzanian farm collectivization and Soviet democracy
That
in
was
the
my
early
next
Soviet
question.
Union and whatever else. But I also
Funny
think about
you-
Medicare for all. You know, I think Medicare for all is our route to Soviet democracy. Though I'm sure this will be clipped and used one day by someone on the right.
I just want to know what's going on with Tanzanian farm collectives.
It didn't work out well, but we'll get the next
Okay.
time. We'll get the next time.
Okay. Next time.
No mass
All right,
famine.
cool.
No mass famine, though. There's been worse examples of socialist collectivization, but we'll leave that
Okay.
for the after hours. Maybe we have a Patreon, right? So
Stay tuned for that. Yeah. All right. Well,
So you
thank
make
you,
the big
Bhaskar. Once again, Bhaskar Sunkara, editor and publisher of Jacobin and Catalyst. And I forgot to mention this earlier, author of the Socialist Manifesto. Bhaskar, do you have any forthcoming projects that you want to shout out, or is it all?
I'm working on a couple books now. I'm almost done one, A History of the Grenadian Revolution, but still in negotiations, figuring out the contract. So please buy my book. Sales have dipped a little bit for the Socialist Manifesto, but it'll really increase my bargaining power for my future projects, which is kind of like career disasters. Like writing a book about the Grenadian Revolution is not going to be good for my prospects as a
Pocketbook.
where it's going to be a good book, but it'll be like Commons.
There's a huge market out there for it.
Commons like electric album where he's like rapping over like weird rock music, and it's kind of like an electronic album with like rock music. Anyway,
That's your Grenadian book.
That's my Grenadian book.
Yeah.
So buy the Socialist Manifesto, subscribe to Jacobin, press like, subscribe, all that, and yeah. See you all later.
Thanks, Bhaskar. See you on the tube
Later.
soon.
Supreme Leader Bhaskar Sunkara.
Indeed. I don't know that I would have initially thought that a talk about social democracy would be this fun, but it's always great to have Bhaskar on. Loved hearing from him, and good points all around, I think.
Yeah, I mean it's his command of different periods of history and different all over the oh yeah, this party and whatever the hell, and this country had this party and they were doing this kind of thing. It's it's always very helpful. I always find Bhaskar very helpful in tying the different eras of history together, because I think most people think of them as kind of static. Then in the 40s there was World War II, and that was that.
right.
And in the 60s there was civil rights, and then that was its own thing. And then but he really does tie the sort of the lines between the eras and sees what we do and the current state of our politics in a sort of coherent whole, like an ongoing struggle, an ongoing process. And I think that I always find that helpful.
I'm realizing now, I sort of wish I had asked him a question about actually existing social democracy in the Nordic states, which is kind of the gold standard today, right? But perhaps that's actually a question for Matt Brunig, who has been a guest on the Jacobin Show and Weekends, right? In the past?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not. Yes. No. I don't remember. No.
Here's our producer,
I've
Young
interviewed in the
Hale,
past.
to
I just don't remember
confirm.
which of the various shows.
Yeah.
We're all one big happy family.
Yeah.
Even though you're a bunch of reformist sock Dems.
Right. Yeah. Kale has only popped onto screen to condemn social democracy. I'm just kidding.
Right. Yeah, actually, you're all complacent. It's actually a ruse. You're actually undermining the cause for communism. And
isn't it like a thing? It's like it's suck dems. They killed Rosa. Like that's the whole thing that they accuse you of these days. Do you know what I'm talking about?
Personally, yeah.
Yes.
Your family. We've traced it back through
My
your
mom's name
23andMe.
is Rosa too. Different Rosa. But yeah.
The connections.
Yeah. Rosa was done dirty. She didn't deserve that at all. Even though, as Bhaskar said, I think some of her analysis is maybe undermined by the actual history of social democracy. But she was like, mad respect to the revolutionaries. Okay,
of course,
even though some of their theory is a little whack, but
we ride for Rosa.
Yeah.
Well, Kale, any last thoughts on social democracy? He pieced out. He's back. Any last thoughts on social democracy before we call it a night?
Yeah, I mean, big fan. Would like it.
Huge fan.
I don't know. I mean,
nice.
I'm a socialist. I'm a Marxist. I have a specific critique of capitalism, and I think socialism, whatever. I think there's different conceptions of what that is, but I do think there are certain key aspects to what socialism will be that do kind of deal with the major problems of capitalism. And so I do think that, there's certain structural mechanisms within capitalism that continue to reproduce the really bad outcomes, and that socialism, as kind of in the principles that guide our process of trying to build towards socialism, they are supposed to ameliorate those. But I think I think we should be humble and be a little, unsure of the future. We shouldn't be so, rock-ribbed deterministic and say, listen, if we get social democracy, that would be a much better world. And if we're able to go beyond it, if we are able to succeed where our predecessors were not able to in the past, of course, I mean, that would be like even better, because that would be the better outcome for the vast majority of humanity. But we should fight like hell, like Bhaskar was saying, for things like Medicare for all and for like basic workplace democracy demands that greater, to the extent that it's possible, to expand democracy into the workplace, into the economy, and to all the other aspects of society, politics and culture that it's lacking currently. I mean, we do want that, and so we should be fighting for those demands and reforms. And we start with the labor movement, or at least we kind of prioritize the labor movement because we know that's what works. And unless we get another better answer, I don't know, we're just going to have to keep coming back to that. So,
listen, since you bring up Marxism, I have one last thought, which actually goes back to our opening segment on conspiracy theories. And this is it. So a few years ago, I reviewed a couple of books on conspiracy theories for the New Republic. And one of the authors was like, there are way few conspiracy theories on the left than on the right, because the left has the ultimate conspiracy theory, Marxism. And the thing is, like, he obviously meant it as a dig, but right. But he, in a way, I mean, going back to something, he's right. Yeah. I mean, I don't know, like, we do believe that there is,
could be a she.
It was a he.
Yeah.
But we do believe, if you want to put it on like very general terms, that there is a small cohort, let's call it the ownership class, that exploits the vast majority of people.
Yeah.
Well, and also not just that, but like it is the role of ideology. If you have a coherent ideology, is that it helps you process these seemingly random events that happen in the news all the time, especially in these days where it's like a torrent of news to your face every single day. What ideology helps you is to sort it into a narrative in a coherent kind of, you can plot the points and be like, oh, this is why this is happening, and in a way it replaces the role of conspiracy, which is to ascribe a narrative to these seemingly random events. Right. We just have the correct narrative, and the other people, it's not as correct,
Well, we know that because like we're scientific socialists, that like it's like we actually like
Are
this
we?
is
speak for yourself, bro. I don't know what that means.
Nando hates science. No, I'm just kidding.
Seriously.
No, I don't know. I mean, just that like I think we treat. I mean, obviously, people who are physicists they're not called Newtonians. They're not called Eisensteinians. We're called Marxists. And I think it's because, to a certain extent, an analysis of capitalism, it's difficult to get it fully to the level of science in the way that like biology or physics can be. And it's largely in part because we're dealing with actual society where there actually are class divisions. Like the fact that Marxism can actually explain how society is divided. It can also then explain why there's going to be limitations for like why people will or won't agree to it, or like why it won't get legitimacy within like social scientists broadly. Like everything that's followed Marx's work, everything in sociology has basically been there to try to disprove Marx, and they've all failed. But like you prove that they failed.
Right.
But just the thing on the conspiracy is just that like, yeah, there are a very small handful. There's like less than 1,000 companies that control all of our lives across the entirety of the globe and humanity. But it's not a conspiracy because they're actually all trying to kill each other. Like there's a structural feature of the economic system that forces them into competition constantly. And so it's more rare that they're going to be united and trying to collaborate together to get what they want. And it's more often the case, especially when you don't have a united working class, when you don't have the state working on behalf of working people, that capitalists are just going to all be knives out trying to, destroy each other because they care above everything else. They care about making a profit. So, and so that's where it's like, you could have different people put in the same companies. They're going to still have to do the same thing. They're going to fight to the death because the system, the fact that they're in a market, they have to compete, and they own all the most important stuff in society, means that they're going to try to kill each other, and then it ends up killing all of us.
Yeah.
So
that's why Epstein was killed.
That's why Epstein was killed.
I get it.
All right. Well, on the subject of competition, everybody go watch some basketball now, I guess. And
That's right.
We'll see you next
Finer
week.
things in life.
Yeah. All right. Good night, guys.
Bye.
Good night.